Our second speaker is Professor James Franklin, who is professor at the University of New South Wales, where his research extends across the fields of mathematics, ethics, and philosophy. His book, Corrupting the Youth, is a history of Australian philosophy, and his intriguing-sounding Restraint project examined the virtue of temperance in a specifically Australian context. And Jim will talk to us today about how to sell the virtue of restraint, Casablanca. Jim, the floor is yours.
Thanks, John. Nice introduction. Let me start with the classic list of the 7 virtues, 4 philosophical virtues and 3 theological ones. The philosophical ones are justice, courage or fortitude, temperance, restraint or self-control, and prudence or practical wisdom. The theological ones are faith, hope, and charity. Charity including everything we call love, care, and benevolence. Now, what about movies about those virtues? I mean, not ironic or half-hearted ones, or ones about the opposite vices, but ones that robustly display those virtues as admirable and worth imitation. I'll leave a few moments silence while you run through the list and see if you can think of movies that are especially good at showing each of them. Well, justice, that's an easy one. To Kill a Mockingbird is a classic about the fight for justice. The courtroom drama setting, such as in 12 Angry Men or the Caine Mutiny, is perfect for framing the theme of justice. Courage is easy as well. High Noon and any number of war movies centre on courage. It's easy to put on screen. You'll notice I'll discuss mostly old movies. One reason is that I don't watch many new ones, but also I think that older ones aren't afflicted by modern nervousness. They don't demand that the hero be morally flawed or complex. They just get on with displaying heroic virtue. Faith, here's a still from The Mission. It's about courage as well as faith. The virtues are intertwined. For hope, I think my favourite is The Wizard of Oz. The characters hope that their trip down the yellow brick road to the wizard will solve their no brain, no heart, too shy problems. Their hopes are realised even though the wizard is a fraud. Charity, this is Going My Way, Best Picture and Best Grossing Movie of 1944. Bing Crosby plays a priest who forms a choir out of boys in a deprived neighbourhood. Okay, that's the easy virtues to make a movie about. Now, temperance and prudence, they're a lot harder. They're a lot harder to sell in general if you're just preaching about them, but also to make a movie about them. So why is that? Well, they're kind of cold virtues, or they're low-key or less exciting. There's more a forethought needed about them. They're not passionate in the way that is easy to display in a movie. Frankly, they're hard virtues to love. You ask, what are they for, really? Well, that's what makes it surprising that temperance or restraint or renunciation is the main theme of the world's best movie, Casablanca. But before we get to that, a quick run through about the virtue of temperance in general. Won't take long, but to display what we're talking about. Well, what it's about is you're tempted to indulge yourself, but you shouldn't, and you restrain your passions and you don't do it. Restrain what? There's a convenient checklist of the 7 deadly sins, the vices you need to avoid indulging: pride, envy, anger, sloth, greed, gluttony, and lust. The word temperance has come to be especially associated in English with restraining drunkenness, as in the temperance movement, and lust, but it applies equally well to all the other vices. If you're tempted to any of those sins, you should restrain yourself. Psychological and political and marketing aspects to it, which I'll just very briefly touch on. Psychologists talk a lot about the marshmallow experiments and delayed gratification. So can 3-year-olds restrain themselves from taking one marshmallow now in the promise of 2 marshmallows in 10 minutes? And it's believed, it's claimed that the longitudinal experiments show that the ones who can will have much more successful and happy lives later. The language of delayed gratification is a bit morally thin in the way psychologists like to do, but to some extent they're talking about the same thing. There's a whole historical matters. The WCTU was the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which existed in many countries, but in Australia especially, it was a very important force behind the women's suffrage movement, which, as you know, was more successful in Australia and New Zealand than in many other countries early. And what they wanted women's suffrage for was to enforce, they thought women would vote for early closing of pubs. And they did, in fact, achieve that political ambition, though only in wartime, when there were some extra reasons for it. There's some image matters. The virtue of temperance has a bit of an image problem, and people are in favour of temperance are accused of wowserism, as we say in Australia, which means a kind of pinched and small-minded attitude that pleasure is bad. On the other hand, people who speak like that, when the kindergarten teacher is taken off for accessing child porn, well, yeah, actually they say we do need restraint. Right, that's enough rundown of the overall situation about the virtue of temperance. Let's get back to the movie I hope we all love, Casablanca. I'm sure I don't need, in a forum like this with experts on film, to summarise the plot of Casablanca, but let me just recall the relevant bits for what I'm talking about in Temperance. But anyway, the essentials are that Rick, played by Humphrey Bogart, is running a nightclub in Vichy-occupied Morocco in Casablanca, and they walk into it by accident. Ilsa, played by Ingrid Bergman, and the resistance hero Victor Laszlo, played by Paul Henreid, pictured there on the left. And their aim is to get out of Casablanca to fly to Lisbon and then on to the US in order to continue his very important resistance work, because he's at the centre of the resistance in many European countries. So there exist 2 letters of transit with magical properties that Rick has come into the possession of that will allow 2 persons and 2 persons only to fly out to Lisbon. It turns out that Ilsa and Rick have been in love a year or so before in Paris, when Ilsa believed that her husband was dead. And they think about taking the 2 trips to Lisbon using the papers. And sorry, that's dreadful that I get the plot of Casablanca wrong. They think of staying in Casablanca, sending him to Lisbon, but they decide not to do that. They will restrain themselves and renounce their love in the interests of his important work, and just the married couple will fly to Lisbon. So here is all you need to know at the moment about the plot of Casablanca. Just remind yourself. Okay, and in a famous little speech about what they're doing, Humphrey Bogart says this: "Ilsa, I'm no good at being noble, but it doesn't take much to see that the problems of 3 little people don't amount to a hill of beans in this crazy world." In the context, that doesn't mean that the problems of 3 little people aren't important. No, they are important. It's just that there's a war on. More important things are happening. And the important thing about this speech is that it explains the point of the virtue of temperance. The point is, there's more important things going on. The reason why you need to restrain yourself is not for its own sake. It's for the sake, it's an enabling virtue. That is, it enables you to do something that's much more important. In this case, enable the resistance heroes' war work to continue. Not forgetting, of course, that it's a war propaganda film as well, so no other ending is morally possible, even either strictly morally or as war propaganda. So in the end, Humphrey Bogart watches the plane fly off, take off to Lisbon, with the resistance work to continue. So it's great because you can see why exactly the virtue of temperance is necessary in the moral context, and it's explained what it's for. Now, let me tell you also that there's a subplot of Casablanca where temperance is also a theme, but in a completely different way. It's the Me Too subplot. This is Claude Rains playing the Captain Renault, the French police chief. He's certainly corrupt, and that's explained very clearly at the beginning. He's also a friend of Rick's. There are actually three moral worlds in Casablanca that conflict. First of all, there's the baddies. There's the Nazis, played by Major Strasser, and there's the resistance hero, and they're completely good, whereas the Nazis are completely bad. But in the middle, there's a moral world that's much more ambiguous. It's got the, shall we say, cynical men of the world. There are three of those. There's Captain Renault, there's Rick himself, as he is at the beginning of the movie, and there's Signor Ferrari, who maintains the Blue Parrot, the competing nightclub. The movie takes an odd attitude to this. At the beginning, it appears that to take a rather indulgent attitude to them. So Captain Renault is using his power to take bribes to allow people visas to get out of Casablanca. Casablanca is full of refugees who all want to get out to Lisbon and the United States. And he takes bribes as money, but he also takes sex as a payment. And at first the movie just takes this as, well, this is how it is. And there's a lot of cynical and sort of male bonding banter between the three people, Rick, Captain Renault and Ferrari. But then all of a sudden the movie changes track and shows the Me Too situation from the other perspective. And Rick is approached by Anina, who's a Bulgarian refugee. She and her husband have arrived in Casablanca and have no money left. And Renault has offered her, in effect, a visa out for both of them for having sex. And so Rick is supposed to give moral advice, which as a cynical man of the world acting in his own behalf is not supposed to be only in his territory. What he does is tell her that he can't help her, but he arranged for the husband to win a lot of money on his crooked gambling tables, and they were able to bribe Renault instead of having to have sex with him. So that is a quite sudden shift in the moral perspective. So from initial indulgence to well, it's not quite clear how condemnatory it becomes. But in the end, actually, in the Captain Renault, in the last scene, joins Rick, and they both go off to join the Free French, where he won't have the same power he has to do whatever he wants to do. So that's all I wanted to say about Casablanca and its marvelous demonstrations of the virtue of restraint. Let me just tell you about one other great movie from back there, and it's not an accident that it's back there in those times when there was depression and war and a lot more need for restraint and temperance. Brief Encounter, but let's not go into the details of that. Now, I think there is something to learn from the way that those movies, especially Casablanca, sell the virtue of restraint for how to do it now. So restraint is sold by scaring people. So there's a lot of work in, for example, drug education. How do you convince teenagers that they should be more careful and not drink themselves stupid and drive and not damage themselves generally. So the standard method of doing that is to tell you what will happen to you. Things will be very bad and you may damage yourself and kill yourself and other people. Well, it's not wrong to do that, but it's a little bit negative, right? Surely we can do something a little bit more positive with some role models. And that's where Casablanca came, and that attitude to it comes in, because Casablanca knows how to explain to you that it's better to be restrained so that you can save your energies or save your possibilities, enable yourself to do things that are noble and much worth doing. So I would say that you should tell people that if you're doing drug education, you say something like this, think of yourself or think of a role model as doing something like this. You're in friends at a party, you all like to drink a fair bit and have a good time, but somebody has to drive home. So you restrain yourself so that everyone gets home safe. If you do that, you can admire yourself as having done the right thing and having a solid and better character. But the point is not, the purpose of doing it is not so you can admire yourself. The purpose of it is to do the right thing to help other people and to make it possible for their safe driving home. And it's a consequence of that that you and other people can admire yourself, that your conscience is clear. So the way Casablanca promotes the virtue of restraint is via a role model and an explanation of what it's for, why it's for the greater good. So I think we can learn something from that. All right, nearly finished, but you may notice that we have left out prudence as well. So here's an exercise. Find me a good movie about the virtue of prudence. I don't know one. So you can, maybe in the question time, you can suggest something to it. Let me tell you what I think the plot line should be. It's something like a very decent, but just a little bit dim, everyman walks into a crisis. They have to step up and think a bit smarter about how to get out of it. Their decency in the end saves them, but they wouldn't have been saved if they hadn't thought a bit, got a bit more cunning. Movies with that. All right, that's all. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Jim. I'm going to be intrigued to find whether anyone rises to that challenge of, I wonder whether Sylvie, for example, might kind of have something. And in fact, Sylvie's is the first hand I see. So yeah, usual thing, please raise your hands via the raise hand in the reactions at the bottom of the screen. But yeah, Sylvie is up first.
Yeah, absolutely agree with Robert's posters. Lord of the Rings, a lot of stuff in there.
Lord of the Rings, yeah, okay.
Yeah. I think it's, to add to that question and ask you my question, I think prudence, like temperance, is probably a virtue that is, it quite often exists in a lot of movies, but it's not foregrounded. It's often something that takes place in the background while we focus on justice and courage and all the other things. But actually,
that's right.
Once you look a bit closer, then you might actually find that in a place like, yeah.
That's right. So because of the unity of the virtues, it can look very ridiculous if you've got just one or two virtues and are completely lacking in the others. So if you're courageous but lack prudence, you're called foolhardy.
Yeah.
I've heard that there's no word for foolhardy in Polish. I don't know about that.
Interesting. Yeah. So my question was really, so I'd really like to talk, thanks, because I love Casablanca, and also because I've also been quite interested in temperance as a virtue and how it's kind of represented in the movies, and so that this was a really interesting way of setting it up. I just wanted to probe you a bit more on the kind of things at the end, because what strikes me is, well, I wonder if we need to make distinctions when we talk about, I mean, you had a nice setup about temperance and how but how there's so many facets about it. So, and I think in Casablanca, obviously, as you said, there's the moral temperance or the moral restraint about not just following your love interest, but kind of making sacrifices for the greater good. But obviously, there is much less temperance when it comes to the things you mentioned at the end, the drinking. And I mean, people are constantly drinking and smoking to some excess, as they do in all of the old movies, especially when you look at Bogart. And we obviously the film is set in these kind of nightclub scenes that by the very nature implies a level of excess in certain kind of things. So I wonder if we need to if they are just facets of the same thing, or if we need to distinguish between
yes, there
moral
is
temperance and something else.
Yeah, there is. I mean, it is true that although it's a nightclub, I think you only see one person drunk, and it does disapprove of her, except when she sings the Marseillaise when drunk. Well, okay, probably that gives her a little bit of extra courage. It's true that there's far too much drinking and smoking in not only Casablanca but a lot of other movies, and the Women's Christian Temperance Union would say we took a bad turn in the mid-20th century, and it's good that we've got back to their point of view. It's true, you need to distinguish that kind of thing. Yeah.
Thank you.